The thing about fear is that it has a sound. Not the scream that comes after. The scream is just the body's way of processing something it already survived. The real sound of fear is the moment before, a low, hollow resonance at the base of the sternum, like a struck bell heard through concrete. Lieutenant Commander Mara Voss had learned that sound in the wreckage of the Caspian station 3 years before anyone had even given the Veth a name. She'd learned it again when the first Fang-class warship materialized above New Helsinki and simply sat there for 11 hours, neither broadcasting nor responding, just watching the city with 14 orbital sensor arrays and the patience of something that had eaten civilizations before this one. She had learned it many times since. She was learning it now, standing at the edge of Observation Platform 7 on the Yusef carrier threshold, watching the Veth Armada hold position across 40,000 kilometers of cold space like a jaw about to close. Voss. Admiral Carver's voice was dry and precise, the way a man speaks when he has already calculated the odds and found them unsatisfying. Your assessment. She didn't look away from the viewport. The Veth ships were beautiful, in the way that viruses were beautiful, elegant, purposeful, evolved for a single function. Each Fang-class vessel was a long, narrow crescent of something that wasn't quite metal, bioluminescent membranes running the length of the hull like nerve sheaths laid bare. They pulsed in a slow rhythm. The fleet scientists had been arguing for 4 years about whether that pulse was biological or mechanical. Mara had never seen the distinction as meaningful. Either way, it was a heartbeat, and right now, 312 hearts were beating in unison across the void, and every single one of them was pointed at Earth. They're waiting, she said. We know they're waiting. Waiting for what? I don't know, sir. That's not an assessment, Commander. No, sir. She finally turned. Carver was standing at the tactical display, a holographic map of the engagement zone throwing pale blue light across the lines of his face. He was 63. He'd fought the Veth at Kepler Station at the Jovian Corridor. At the dark side engagement they were calling the Battle of February, even though it had lasted 5 weeks. He had the specific kind of tiredness that wasn't sleep deprivation but history deprivation. The look of a man who had lived through too much that shouldn't have happened. They've never held formation this long without an engagement. The longest previous static deployment was 4 hours at Kepler. This is 16 and counting. Something has changed in their calculus. Or something hasn't changed, the Admiral said, and they're just letting us sweat. Veth don't play psychological games, sir. They've never demonstrated that kind of warfare. They've never needed to. She had no answer for that. The Veth had arrived at the solar system 8 years ago, not with a declaration or a demand, or even the simple territorial assertion of a first contact, but with a demonstration. They had dismantled the mining colony on Callisto in 47 minutes. Not bombed it, dismantled it, extracted the colony's structural components with systematic precision, deposited the organic matter back on the surface in small, sorted piles and moved on without acknowledgement. The message was not aggressive. It was in some ways worse. They had done what you had to do with something small and uncomplicated. They had tidied up. Then they had waited. The waiting was the part that had fractured the first 2 years of human response. Half the governments on Earth had pushed for immediate high-level contact. The other half had pushed for immediate weapons development. They had managed somehow to accomplish both simultaneously and effectively. The diplomatic track had produced a rudimentary communication protocol. The Veth used a form of structured light pulse encoding that had taken human xenolinguists 14 months to partially decode, and the weapons track had produced the splinter drives, the mass displacement warheads, and the carrier platform Threshold herself, which was the largest military vessel humanity had ever launched and which carried, in addition to her 3,000 crew, a complement of 44 Splinter-class interceptors and enough mass displacement ordnance to crack the crust of a small moon. Neither track had produced peace or war, just this, the Armada and the waiting. Mara had been on the diplomatic track before she'd been on the military one. She'd spent 2 years as part of the Yusef First Contact Analysis Group, sitting in a sealed room in Reykjavik with 11 other people, studying recordings of the one contact event that had ever produced what might charitably be called a conversation. It had happened 4 years ago, in the wreckage of Caspian Station, and the human on the other end of it had not been a diplomat. She thought about him now, the way she always did when the fear bell rang. She thought about the man they called the Watchmaker. His name was Elias Dre, and the Veth had first encountered him the same way they encountered most things. They hadn't. He had encountered them. This was the detail that the xenolinguists found most significant. And Mara had come to agree with their assessment. In every other engagement, Every other observed interaction, the Veth had been the initiators. They chose the timing, the location, the terms of the meeting. They arrived. They assessed. They acted. The arrival of something they had not anticipated, at a time and place of its own choosing, appeared to produce in the Veth something that had no clean translation in their communication protocol, but that the analysis team had provisionally labeled categorical reassessment. Elias Dre had described it differently. He'd called it a double take. He had been, a systems engineer. He'd been working aboard Caspian Station, a deep space communications relay built into the asteroid belt, when the Veth had dismantled it in the same methodical way they dismantled Callisto. He'd survived by accident. He'd been in a maintenance shaft checking a faulty conduit coupling when the hull started coming apart around him, and the maintenance shaft had been near enough to a sealed emergency cache that he'd made it inside before the pressure equalized with space. He'd survived the initial dismantlement in a sealed pocket of air and power, with emergency rations for 3 days and a tools kit that hadn't been inventoried since 2031. The Veth, in their systematic extraction of the station's components, had found the sealed maintenance shaft and had done something that no Veth unit had ever done before in any recorded contact event. They had opened it, not to extract him. They had moved him, carefully, with the same methodical precision they applied to structural components, to a pressurized examination space inside the Fang-class vessel that had led the Caspian dismantlement. And there, for 11 days, they had studied him. Mara had spent months with the recordings of those 11 days, along with every member of the analysis team. They were partial. Elias had built a rudimentary recording device from components in the tools kit on day 3, and it had functioned sporadically, but what they showed was, by any measure, extraordinary. Not because the Veth had studied him. They'd done that at Callisto, in the early days before anyone knew what they were doing with the samples they'd taken. What was extraordinary was what had happened on day 7, when Elias Dre had stopped being a subject and started being a nuisance. The recording from day 7 was the one Mara had memorized. It was 43 seconds long, grainy, shot from an oblique angle, and it showed Elias Dre sitting cross-legged on the floor of the examination space with what appeared to be a disassembled component of the examination array spread around him in careful order. He was holding what the analysis team had eventually identified as the timing mechanism of Veth Environmental Regulator, a device that controlled the atmospheric cycling inside the pressurized space, and he was, with the calm focus of a man who had nothing left to lose, modifying it. The Veth unit that entered the examination space 3 seconds into the recording was large. The Veth has always appeared large in recordings, their joint architecture making them look like something assembled from the bones of multiple different animals, the sensory cluster at the leading end capable of a range of orientations that humans tended to describe as head movements, but that the xenolinguists insisted were more analogous to reconfiguring a compound eye. It moved toward Elias with the specific intent of retrieval. He was, after all, a component that had been displaced from its organized position. What it did not do, what no Veth unit had ever done, was stop. But it stopped. Because Elias Dre, without looking up from the timing mechanism he was modifying, said 3 words in English that happened, through the partial and incomplete accident of 2 years of human xenolinguists, working in the other direction from the Veth's own analytical systems, to map approximately, not perfectly, not cleanly, but approximately, to a structured light pulse concept in the Veth communication matrix. He said, "Give me a minute." And it stopped. Mara had reconstructed what happened next from Elias's own account, given in 4 separate debrief sessions over the 6 weeks following his recovery. She'd sat in on 3 of them. He was not, by any measure, a remarkable-looking man. Medium height, lean in the specific way of people who had spent years on stations where caloric rationing was standard. Practice, dark-complexioned in the way of someone with ancestry from multiple continents, which was most of humanity by the late 21st century. His hands were remarkable. She'd noticed that immediately. They were the hands of someone who spent his life taking things apart and putting them back together, scarred at the knuckles and calloused at the tips, and always moving, even in conversation, even in stillness, working through some invisible problem with a small rotating motion of the thumb against the index finger. He had sat in the debrief chair and spoken about 11 days aboard a Veth vessel, with the patient specificity of a man giving a technical report. And the thing that had stayed with Mara was not the information he conveyed, but the absence of the fear bell in his voice. Not the absence of fear itself. He'd been afraid. He said so plainly. He'd been afraid every moment of every one of those 11 days. But the bell had rung, and he had taken note of it and moved on, the way you moved on from a known variable. It stopped because it was curious, he'd said about the Veth unit in the recording, or something that functions like curiosity. It had identified me as something that followed a pattern, the pattern of something that needed to be returned to its organized position. Then I did something outside the pattern, and it recalculated. I think they're extremely good at pattern recognition and extremely dependent on it. When the pattern breaks, they have to stop and reassemble their model. And you understood that at the time, the debrief officer had asked. Not clearly, instinctively. I grew up working in my uncle's repair shop. You learn to read machines by the way they hesitate. He turned the thumb and index finger rotation. They hesitate when they hit something they weren't designed for. He had spent the remaining 4 days of captivity demonstrating to the Veth, in the only language available to him, the language of taking things apart and putting them back together, of modification and calibration, and the specific human compulsion to make things work better than they were designed to, that he was not a component to be organized. He had repaired the environmental regulator. He had also quietly improved it, increasing its cycling efficiency by approximately 12%, using a modification that the Veth had apparently not previously implemented, despite the fact that their technology was, in every other measurable dimension, far in advance of humanity's. He had done this because he was bored and frightened, and because fixing things was what he did when he was bored and frightened. The Veth had deposited him, alive, in an escape pod near the debris field of Caspian Station, where he had been recovered by a USEF search and rescue vessel 17 hours later. He had been given the name Watchmaker by a xenolinguist in the analysis group who had become frustrated with calling him Subject Alpha, and the name had stuck because it was accurate. He watched things. He understood how they moved. He fixed them. He had been assigned to Mara's unit 2 years later, with the rank of civilian specialist, over the considerable objections of 12 separate USEF command officers who felt that the correct response to the man who had survived 11 days aboard a Veth vessel was not to put him near the Veth again. Mara had argued patiently and at length that the correct response to the man who had survived 11 days aboard a Veth vessel was to put him wherever he was most useful, and that he was most useful near the Veth. She had won the argument. She was not standing now at the observation platform watching the Fang-class armada breathe with its slow, bioluminescent rhythm, entirely certain she'd been right. The Caspian incident had not been the first time Elias Dre had been in a situation where the correct response was to stay calm while everything came apart around him. Mara had read his full personnel file during the 2 weeks between his assignment to her unit and his arrival on the threshold, and the file was the portrait of a man whose particular skill set seemed to have been refined specifically by disaster. He had grown up in Port-au-Prince, and then Bogota, and then a series of deep space habitats, as his family followed orbital construction work, which meant he had spent his formative years in environments where the infrastructure was always provisional, and the maintenance staff was always 2 people short, and the correct response to any system failure was to fix it yourself, because nobody else was coming for at least 3 days. He had earned his engineering certification at 18. Working maintenance on the Bering Transit Station, one of the older habitats in the system with a hull that had been patched so many times the original material was now a minority component of the outer bulkhead. The chief engineer at Bering, a woman named Haverford, who had been fixing things in space for 30 years, had written a note in Elias's certification file that Mara had read 4 times, because it was the most accurate description of him she'd encountered. He doesn't fix things because he's been trained to. He fixes things because not fixing them produces in him a specific kind of personal discomfort that he can't override. If you give him access to a broken system in sufficient time, he will either repair it or die trying, and if he dies trying, he will leave very good notes about what he found. He had arrived on the threshold, carrying 2 duffel bags, a worn shoulder toolkit, and 3 separate tablet devices, each running different software suites. He had been assigned quarters on Deck 7 and had moved into them with the same focused economy he applied to everything, which was to say he had put the duffel bags on the bunk and immediately gone to the nearest terminal and begun working. Mara had not introduced herself for 24 hours. She'd been busy, and also, she'd wanted to see what he did when left alone in a new environment. The terminal logs showed that in his first 24 hours on the threshold, he had identified and documented 3 separate maintenance issues in the Deck 7 environmental system, submitted a report on a suboptimal configuration in the sensor array calibration schedule, and spent 8 hours studying, recorded Veth carrier wave transmissions that Mara had not yet cleared him for access to, because he had worked out the data pathway to the archive server in about an hour and accessed them himself. She had walked into the bunk room at hour 25 to introduce herself and found him surrounded by 3 tablets displaying different sections of the same carrier wave recording, and he had looked up with the expression of a man who knows he's done something mildly unauthorized and has decided the result is worth it. The pulse encoding, he'd said by way of greeting. The researchers has been decoding it as a unitary signal. It's not. There's a secondary harmonic embedded in the primary wave. I think they've been translating the instrument and missing the song. She stared at him for a long moment. You've been here 25 hours, she said. 26. I couldn't sleep. The environmental system in this section cycles inefficiently. He turned back to the tablets. I've put in a maintenance request. Also, the secondary harmonic in the carrier wave, it's more complex than the primary. I think it might be older, which would be interesting, because it would mean... I know what it would mean, she said. He'd looked at her with the flat, attentive look he used when he was calibrating a new system. Then you've already found it. I've suspected it for 6 months. I couldn't demonstrate it mathematically. I have a working model. Preliminary. It'll need more data to confirm. She'd sat down on the opposite bunk and looked at the tablets. How long? To confirm. 6 months to a year, depending on what the Armada gives us. He'd turned the rotation, unless something happens that gives us more data faster. It had taken 8 months, and a fleet of 312 Fang-class warships holding position for 22 hours before the data accelerated. But the acceleration, when it came, had been sufficient. Elias found her on the observation platform at hour 18. She heard him before she saw him, not because he was loud, he was almost never loud, but because he had a specific way of walking in thought, a barely perceptible half step that was the physical equivalent of the thumb rotation. And she had learned it over 2 years of working alongside him. He came to stand at the viewport beside her and was quiet for a moment, looking at the fleet. You didn't sleep, she said. I was working! On what? The pulse pattern. He had a tablet, of course. He always had a tablet. He lifted it slightly toward the viewport, not really showing her. He knew she didn't have the contextual framework to read what he was working with. But the gesture was habitual, the way you indicated a thing you'd been thinking about. It changed at hour 14. The period increased by 3 milliseconds. Then at hour 17, it increased again. Same increment. She looked at him. 3 milliseconds each time. 3.12. He lowered the tablet. It's counting. The fear bell rang. She turned back to the fleet. 312 hearts, all beating together, and the beat was slowing in precise increments, counting down, counting towards something. How many increments until? I don't know what it's counting to, he said before she could finish. Could be a round number in their system. Could be a specific event time. Could be a threshold they're waiting for us to cross. He paused. There's one other possibility. Tell me. It could be a clock that's been running since before they got here. In which case, we're not watching a countdown. We're watching a running total. He tapped the tablet. How long since the first contact to Callisto? She turned that over. 8 years, give or take. 8 years, 4 months, and 17 days, Elias said. In Veth pulse time encoding, extrapolating from the communication protocol data, that's approximately. He looked at the tablet. 443,000 running increments. She stared at him. I think they've been patient, he said. I think their patience has a number. And I think we're approaching it. On Deck 9, in the Threshold's Xenoanalysis lab, Dr. Priya Narayanan was working alone at the kind of hour that didn't have a name. She'd been one of the original Reykjavik team, one of the 11 people who had spent 2 years in a sealed room studying recordings of 11 days, aboard a Veth vessel, and she had never left the field, which was what she called it, even though the field was, technically, a carrier ship holding position above the largest alien armada in human history. She had been one of the people who found Elias's secondary harmonic theory credible before it was demonstrated, which had put her in a minority of 3 in the xenolinguistics division, and earned her a note in her professional file that said something about methodological risk appetite. She considered this a compliment. What she was working on at the nameless hour was the Veth pulse records from the past 14 months, specifically the 342 carrier wave transmissions that the Veth had sent in the old language since Elias had built his first device and opened the channel. She had been building a lexicon, the way you built a lexicon for any partially known language, by accumulating context, by finding repeating elements in different environments, by making careful, tentative structural inferences, and then checking them against new data and revising. It was slow. It was often wrong. It was the most interesting work she had done in her life. The thing she was looking at now was a repeating structural element that appeared in approximately 30% of the carrier wave transmissions. It had appeared in the first transmission, in the message that Elias had translated as still here. It had appeared in the message identifying Elias as the one who changed the interval. It had appeared in 12 of the subsequent 30 messages. It appeared again in the longest carrier wave transmission, the one that had asked about the derivation of the modified timing interval. She had been calling it Marker 7 in her notes, because she had identified 6 other structural elements first, and this was the 7th. Marker 7 was not a word in any conventional sense. It was a structural position, a position in the carrier wave signal relative to the primary pulse baseline, and what it did was modify the grammatical weight of everything adjacent to it. It was, she had come to think, somewhere between a question mark and an honorific. It marked a statement as one made in the mode of inquiry directed towards something that was worth inquiring about. You didn't deploy Marker 7 in casual communication. You deployed it when you were speaking to, or about something whose existence constituted a genuine unknown. Every carrier wave message that Priya had translated as a genuine question, not a status query, not a calibration check, not a formal protocol confirmation, contained Marker 7. And every carrier wave message that referred to Elias Dre contained Marker 7. She sat with that for a long time. Then she pulled up the running total of Veth contacts over 8 years. Diplomatic approach attempts from humanity, ignored. Signal broadcasts, ignored. The 2 acknowledgments that had preceded weapons tests. And then 14 months of carrier wave exchange in the old language, initiated by a man with a home-built device and an instinct that a system should listen. She opened a new document and wrote, "The Veth have not been assessing us as a potential threat. They have not been assessing us as potential subjects of organization. They have been assessing us as a potential source of genuine unknowns. In their formal derivational framework, we do not exist. Our development trajectory is not derivable from their first principles. This is not a deficiency in their framework. It is a signal." She paused. She wrote, "Elias is not interesting to them because he survived. Lots of things survive. He is interesting to them because when they tried to formally derive him, they failed. He contains something their framework cannot account for. They have been asking questions because they want to know what that something is, not to replicate it, not to organize it, to understand it." She saved the document and sent it to Mara's secure line with a header that said, "Non-urgent but relevant." Then she went back to the carrier wave records and kept working. She did not know that in the morning, the non-urgent would become very urgent, and that the document she'd written in the nameless hours would be the clearest description anyone had produced of what was about to happen. Admiral Carver did not, to his credit, dismiss the assessment. He was a man who had survived 3 major engagements with the Veth, and he had survived them by listening to things that didn't fit his existing model, because the existing model kept producing outcomes in which humans lost badly, and the Veth demonstrated, again, that they had organized everything. He called a full senior staff briefing within the hour. Mara presented Elias's analysis. Elias sat beside her and answered technical questions in the precise, patient way he answered all questions, and when the fleet tactical officer challenged the methodology, which was fair, it was an extrapolation built on a partial translation matrix and a 3 millicanton pulse increment. Elias said, "I know," and produced 3 additional data sets that the officer had apparently not seen, and the officer went quiet. Priya had asked to be present at the briefing, and Mara had cleared her. She sat at the far end of the table and said nothing during the presentation or the technical challenge. And when the floor opened for wider discussion, she raised her hand and said quietly that she had sent Commander Voss a document that morning and wondered if it had been read, and Mara said she'd read it at 0400 and it was being incorporated into the briefing appendix. And Priya nodded once and sat back. "If this is accurate," Carver said at the end of the briefing, "what do we do with it?" "We contact them," Elias said. The room went quiet in a different way than it had gone quiet for the tactical challenge. This was the quiet of people sitting with an idea that they found both obvious and terrifying. "We've been attempting contact for 8 years, Fleet Commander Osi said. "They've acknowledged our protocols twice. Both times the acknowledgement was followed by a weapons test. We've been attempting diplomatic contact," Elias said, "sending status messages, identifying ourselves, requesting talks. From their end, that looks like a component announcing itself and asking to be organized." He set the tablet down on the briefing table and turned the thumb and index finger rotation. "I was aboard one of their ships for 11 days. I didn't make contact by sending status messages. What do you propose? Carver asked. I propose we talk to them the way I talk to them. Not in words, not in formal protocol. He looked at the Admiral. I propose we do something they haven't seen us do before. Something outside the pattern. Carver studied him. What specifically? Elias turned to the viewport. The Armada was still there, the pulse still breathing its slow countdown in the dark. The environmental regulator, he said. The one I modified on Caspian. That modification is still running. I can see the efficiency signature in their hull emissions. I've been looking for it since we arrived. It's small, but it's there. Every Fang-class vessel in that fleet is running a version of the modification I made on a station they dismantled 8 years ago. Nobody spoke. They kept it, he said. They found something a human made, and they kept it, and they used it. That's not organization. That's not pattern recognition. That's something else. He looked around the room. We need them to remember what that felt like. We need to show them something they haven't predicted. Not a weapon, not a signal, not a declaration. Something they haven't seen us do. What haven't they seen us do? The fleet surgeon asked from the far end of the table. She was the quietest person in the room and the one, in Mara's experience, most likely to ask the right question. Elias looked at her. A brief, slight smile crossed his face, the expression of a man who has arrived at an answer he isn't entirely sure is an answer. Build something, he said. For them. Specifically for them. The next 6 hours were the most compressed and specific kind of controlled chaos that Mara had ever been part of. Elias requisitioned components from 3 different departments, cleared half of Engineering Bay 4, and worked with a focus that felt, to the people watching him, less like engineering and more like translation. He moved between workstations and component bins with the half-step thought walk, picking up and discarding and modifying with the same systematic patience he'd applied to the VETH environmental regulator 11 years ago, and every now and then he would stop and look at the tablet, and then at the thing growing on the workbench and make a small adjustment, a hair's breadth recalibration, the kind of change that was invisible to everyone else in the room, but that he made with absolute conviction. Mara stayed through all of it. She wasn't required to. She was required technically to be coordinating fleet readiness protocols with the carrier's defense teams, but she had learned over 2 years that being present while Elias worked was itself a form of readiness. He thought out loud when he worked, not continuously but intermittently, and the fragments he spoke were not always explicable in the moment, but were always, retroactively, the shape of the solution he was building toward. Priya stayed too, perched on a secondary workbench with her tablet, running the carrier wave grammar data, and occasionally asking Elias a question that he answered without looking up. They had developed this working dynamic over 8 months, the engineer and the linguist operating in parallel, and it produced, Mara had observed, a specific kind of result. The device Elias built carried in its encoding the grammatical structure that Priya had documented, which meant it was not just a signal but a sentence. A thing built in the right structural position, carrying the right grammatical weight, to be read as something worth responding to. The pulse encoding, Elias said at hour 2 without looking up. It's bimodal. I missed that the first time I saw it at Caspian. I thought it was noise in the transmission medium. It's not. There's a carrier wave underneath the primary pulse, and the carrier wave is different. His hands moved over a circuit assembly that Mara could not identify. The primary pulse is communication. The carrier wave is something else. Something biological, I think, or the VETH equivalent of biological. What does that mean? She asked. It means their communication system evolved from something, or was adapted from something. He paused. It means there's an older language underneath the one we've been studying. Priya looked up from her tablet. Meeker 7 appears in everything transmitted in the old language that refers to Dre, she said, to nobody in particular. In the VETH framework I've been reconstructing, Marker 7 is a grammatical position that signals genuine inquiry toward a genuine unknown. It's reserved. They don't use it lightly. How often does it appear? Mara asked. In all recorded formal VETH communications, in the 17 months we've been logging carrier wave exchange, 31 times. She paused. 12 of those 31 are in messages about her to Elias. He didn't look up, but the thumb and index finger rotation slowed briefly, the way it did when something landed that he was filing away to think about later. At hour 4, he said, the modification I made to the environmental regulator. It increased efficiency because it altered the timing interval between cycling phases. The VETH design cycled on a fixed interval. Fixed intervals are wasteful because the actual need varies. Atmospheric composition shifts depending on activity levels, temperature gradients, all of it. I introduced a responsive interval. It listens to what the space actually needs and adjusts. He held up a small component, studied it. That's the part they kept. Not the specific mechanism, the principle. The idea that a system should listen to its environment and respond. He set the component down. That's the conversation I had with them. I told them a system could listen. And now you're saying it, Mara said. Now I'm saying it more clearly. He picked up a different component. The first time I said it, I was scared and tired and working on instinct. This time I know the language a little better. At hour 5, Priya set down her tablet and walked over to the workbench and stood beside Elias for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "The question you're building. In the carrier wave grammar, what grammatical position is it in?" Elias looked at her. "The 7th. She nodded slowly. "Good. What's good about it?" Mara asked. "Marker 7, Priya said. He's building the question the mode of genuine inquiry toward a genuine unknown." She looked at the device on the workbench. He's telling them the question is real. At hour 6, Elias stepped back from the workbench and looked at what he'd built. It was approximately 40 centimeters across, roughly elliptical, built from components that included, by Mara's count, pieces of a USEF environmental monitoring sensor, 3 sections of signal relay cable, a component of the carrier's waste heat recovery system, 2 items she didn't recognize at all, and what appeared to be part of the electronic assembly from a standard-issue field medical kit. It was connected by 17 wires to a power source, and it was emitting, in the specific frequency range of VETH bioluminescent pulse communication, a signal. "What is it?" she asked. "It's a response," he said, "to their carrier wave, to the old language underneath the new one." He turned the thumb and index finger rotation. "I've been listening to their carrier wave for 48 hours, and I think I understand enough of the structure to respond. Not in words, in principle." He looked at her. "I built them a question." The question took 11 minutes to reach the Armada across 40,000 kilometers of space. The response took 4. It came not as a signal but as movement, or rather as the cessation of movement, which in a fleet that had been holding absolute position for 22 hours produced the same visible effect as an earthquake. The Fang-class vessels at the outer edge of the formation shifted, small corrections, barely perceptible at this range but measurable, and the pulse pattern that Elias had been tracking changed in 3 simultaneous and related ways that he identified within seconds and described to the room with the specificity of someone reading a text. "They're acknowledging the signal," he said. "They recognize the frequency band. He stopped, his hands going still, which was as close to shock as Elias Dre ever came. "They're responding in the carrier wave. They're using the old language. They haven't used it in any of the 8 years of contact events." Carver was standing at his shoulder. "Can you translate it?" "Not accurately. Not yet." He was already back at the device, adjusting, listening, approximately, roughly. "The closest English approximation I can give you," and I want to be clear, this is an approximation built on 48 hours of analysis and some significant guesswork. "Give me the approximation." Elias looked at the device, at the pulse pattern on his tablet, at the fleet across 40,000 kilometers of dark. "Still here," he said. "I think it means still here, like a question. Are they asking if we're still here? No." He shook his head, very slightly. "I think they're answering. I think they heard my question and they answered it." He looked at Mara. "I asked them in their own carrier wave, 'Are you still counting?' And they said, 'Still here.'" The room was quiet. "Which means what?" Carver said. "It means the counting might not be a countdown at all," Mara said, before Elias could answer, because she'd felt the shape of it arrive in her understanding, the way shapes sometimes arrived, fully formed, when you'd been building toward them without knowing. "It means they've been waiting to see if we were still here. Still present. Still responding to the environment, not just surviving." She looked at Elias. "You told them a system should listen. They've been checking to see if we were listening." 8 years, Carver said. 8 years, 4 months, and 17 days, Elias said. "To run a test," Carver said. There was something in his voice, not quite disbelief, but the specific flatness of a man adjusting an assumption he'd held for a very long time. "To ask a question," Priya said, from the back of the room. Everyone looked at her. "There's a difference," she said, "between running a test and asking a question. A test has predetermined criteria. A question is open. You don't know what answer you'll receive." She looked at the viewport. "They asked us an open question. In their own framework. That's extraordinary." "What was the question?" Carver asked. "Are you something we don't already know?" What followed was not simple. Nothing in First Contact is simple. The science fiction stories had always imagined it as either a single transcendent moment of universal, understanding, or a single catastrophic moment of irreversible conflict, and the reality, as with most things, was neither. It was slow and difficult, and full of misunderstandings that took weeks to untangle. And there were 3 incidents in the first 6 months that came very close to unraveling the entire fragile structure that Elias had begun to build from 48 hours of carrier wave analysis and a device made from a field medical kit. But it held. It held because Elias was patient in the specific way that people who spend their lives listening to machines are patient. He didn't require progress to proceed. He required only signal. As long as the Veth were still transmitting in the carrier wave, still using the old language, still responding to the devices he built and rebuilt and modified as his understanding grew, he kept working. Mara coordinated. She ran interference with command, translated Elias's technical assessments into language that admirals could act on, argued against the 3 separate decisions to escalate militarily that occurred in the first year of what was very cautiously beginning to be called negotiation. She was not always successful. There were 2 weapons tests in the first year, one on each side, that set the whole process back by months. But she kept the channel open. The first weapons test had been theirs. A junior tactical officer on the Threshold sister ship Perseverance had misinterpreted a Veth formation shift as a preliminary attack configuration and launched 2 mass displacement warheads at the outer edge of the Armada. The warheads had detonated at the calculated midpoint, producing an electromagnetic discharge that had briefly disrupted communications across the entire engagement zone. The Veth had responded by retreating their 3 outermost vessels by 12,000 kilometers and going silent on all channels, including the carrier wave, for 11 days. Elias had spent those 11 days rebuilding his translation apparatus from scratch on the theory that if they were going to get another chance, it should be a better one. He had also, in the 4th day of silence, written a note and asked Mara to enter it formally into the diplomatic log, which she did. The note said, "The warhead deployment was not authorized by the negotiating team. We are attempting to resolve the command issue. We understand if the incident has changed your assessment of us. We are still here." The silence had ended on day 12 with a carrier wave transmission that Priya had translated over the course of 24 hours, and that read, in her careful provisional rendering, "Your apology structure is understood. The incident is incorporated into the model. We note that your organizations do not act with unified purpose. This is consistent with our observations. We are continuing the inquiry." Mara had read that translation twice and then walked to the engineering bay and told Elias, who had been awake for 31 hours working on the rebuilt apparatus. He had listened and nodded and said, "Good," and gone back to work. She had stood there for a moment. Good that they're continuing the inquiry, or good about the organizational observation? Both, he said. They expected us to have a unified purpose. We don't. That's information. They're updating their model. He turned the rotation. Every time we surprise them, they update the model. Every update is a reason to keep talking. The xenolinguists joined the work 6 months in, when Elias had accumulated enough carrier wave data to produce a partial grammar. They were frustrated at first by his methodology. He was an engineer, not a linguist, and he approached language the way he approached everything else, as a system with components and functions and failure modes. But the frustration gave way, slowly, to something that looked like respect, because his approach produced results that their approach had not. He had gotten the Veth to use their old language by not trying to speak it perfectly. He had gotten them to respond by building things that demonstrated, in function rather than declaration, what he was attempting to say. He built a Veth atmospheric regulator with a responsive timing interval, and installed it on one of the Yusef shuttle decks, and sent an unmanned shuttle toward the Armada with the regulator running and nothing else. 3 days later, a Veth vessels dispatched a drone to examine the shuttle, and the drone spent 4 hours examining the regulator before returning to the fleet. 40 minutes after that, the Fang-class vessel at the center of the formation, the command vessel, the one that had led the Caspian dismantlement, the one that had been running Elias's modification for 8 years, sent a carrier wave transmission of unusual length and complexity. The xenolinguists worked on it for 2 weeks. Elias worked on it for 3 days. His translation was shorter, rougher, and, when the linguists checked it against their own work, approximately correct. The message said, "We have been studying your modification. We do not understand how you arrived at it. The interval you introduced is not derivable from first principles of atmospheric regulation. It requires a form of inference that is not present in our engineering knowledge base. Please explain the process by which you arrived at this solution." Elias read the translation twice. Then he put the tablet down and laughed. A real laugh, the kind that was mostly relief. And Mara, reading the translation over his shoulder, felt the fear bell in her chest go quiet for what might have been the first time in 3 years. What's funny? She asked. Nothing, really. He picked the tablet back up. I know the answer, and it's so simple that I'm not sure they'll understand it. What is it? I guessed, he said. I was tired and scared, and I'd been sitting in that examination space for six days with nothing to do, and I just tried something. Based on instinct, based on intuition, based on having fixed enough machines that I'd developed a sense for what was likely to work without being able to formally derive why. He turned the tablet over in his hands. I arrived at the solution by guessing. And that's remarkable because they can't do it, or they haven't done it, or they don't recognize it as a valid cognitive operation. He set the tablet down. They have inference. They have pattern recognition. They have what is essentially an enormous capacity for deriving solutions from first principles. But guessing, intuiting, arriving at something without a formal derivation, because of experience and feeling and the specific accumulated texture of having tried 1,000 other things and failed, that's different. That's human. Or at least it's not Veth. He was quiet for a moment. I think that's what they've been trying to understand. For 8 years, they studied us. They took samples. They ran their pattern recognition and their formal derivations. And they couldn't explain how we built what we built. The specific trajectory of human technological development, all the wrong turns, the failed experiments, the things that worked for reasons nobody quite understood, the solutions that arrived by accident and intuition and pig-headed stubbornness, it doesn't derive from first principles. It's a record of guessing. He looked at her. We're not what they expected. They expected something they could organize. And instead, they found something they couldn't derive. She thought about that. They dismantled Callisto because they thought we were organizable. Then they found Caspian and found you. And I wasn't organizable, he said. I was just inconveniently alive and working on something. That made them stop. That made them ask a question in a mode they reserve for genuine unknowns. He looked at the tablet with Priya's Marker 7 analysis, which she had sent through that morning. We've been thinking about this wrong. The whole 8 years of contact history. We thought we were trying to prove ourselves worthy of survival, show them we could fight, show them we could negotiate, show them we were a civilization that deserved to persist. But that's not the question they were asking. What question were they asking? He looked up. Are you strange enough to be worth knowing? The response he sent to the Veth's question about the derivation process was not a verbal explanation. It was consistent with everything he had done since Caspian, built rather than spoken. He constructed, over the course of 4 days, a demonstration. A small automated system designed to solve a particular class of engineering problem, and designed to solve it badly first, deliberately, systematically badly, and then progressively less badly, documenting each failure, updating its approach based on what the failures revealed, until it converged on a solution that had not been derivable from its starting conditions, but that was reachable, unavoidably, by the specific path of having tried everything else. He sent the demonstration to the Armada with a carrier wave transmission that Priya helped him structure, placed in Marker 7's grammatical position, labeled, as precisely as she could manage, something like, "This is how." The Veth studied it for 6 days. Then they sent a response that contained, embedded in the carrier wave grammar, a structure that Priya had not seen before. She worked on it for a week, cross-referencing everything in the accumulated translation database, asking Elias twice for his engineering reading of the signal architecture, until she arrived at a translation that she presented to Mara with the specific care of someone handling something fragile. The response said, "This process does not have a formal derivation. It requires the willingness to be wrong. In our engineering framework, willingness to be wrong is not a cognitive state. It is a failure mode." Then it said, "We would like to discuss this." Mara read the translation and sat with it for a long time. She thought about the Veth dismantling Callisto with systematic precision, depositing the organic matter back on the surface in sorted piles, tidying up. The efficiency of something that had never been wrong in a way it learned from. The terrible, comprehensive certainty of a species that derived everything from first principles, and arrived at correct answers and built its knowledge base on the foundation of those correct answers, layer by layer for 100,000 years. And then the thing they had encountered that didn't fit, the thing that had wrong answers in its history, whole archives of wrong answers, centuries of dead ends, and failed experiments and things that didn't work, and that had built its knowledge base on the foundation of those failures, extracting from each one the specific signal of what to try next, until the accumulated failures were themselves a form of navigation, not derivations, but a feel for the territory, refined by everything that had gone wrong. She thought about a man in a maintenance shaft, turning a timing mechanism over in his hands, modifying it based on a guess. She thought we were never going to be organized. We're too complicated for that, too contradictory, too full of failures we learned from and accidents we survived and solutions we arrived at sideways. You can't organize something that keeps doing things for reasons it can't formally derive. You can only, eventually, stop trying to organize it and start asking it questions. The first formal meeting between Veth representatives and the Yusef Negotiation Council occurred 14 months after Elias built his carrier wave device in Engineering Bay 4. It took place in a pressurized neutral zone constructed jointly between the threshold and the Veth command vessel, a deliberately simple space with no furniture, no symbolic objects, nothing that either side could misread as territorial assertion. Mara was part of the Yusef delegation. Elias was standing 2 positions to her left. The Veth who entered the neutral zone were 5. Their architecture was in person, even more striking than in recordings. The specific jointed quality of their movement conveyed something that was not quite grace, but was absolutely purposeful. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. Their sensory clusters moved constantly, the compound eye configuration processing everything in the room simultaneously. They had no faces in the human sense, no expressions that Mara could read by default, but she had spent 14 months studying them, and she had developed very tentatively a vocabulary of minor signals, the angle of the leading joint, the orientation of the sensory cluster, the rhythm of the bioluminescent pulse at the membrane sheath along the primary limb. The lead Veth was by her reading uncertain. Not afraid, she had come to think the Veth did not experience fear the way humans did, which was itself a point of profound fascination to the xenolinguists, but uncertain, operating at the edge of their model, which was, she suspected, exactly where Elias had wanted them. The formal part of the meeting lasted 40 minutes and accomplished almost nothing specific. The xenolinguists had prepared an exchange of baseline statements, confirming the mutual recognition of sovereignty and the mutual cessation of hostile action. And the Veth had prepared something structurally similar, and the 2 things were exchanged with the careful, ceremonial weight of objects placed on a very fragile surface. The moment that Mara would remember, the moment she would carry forward and return to in the years of negotiation, and occasional near collapse and eventual, grinding, imperfect, miraculous progress that followed, happened outside the formal protocol. It happened because the lead Veth, after the exchange of formal statements, paused, held still in a way that even Mara, with her 14 months of careful study, found difficult to interpret, and then oriented its sensory cluster toward Elias Dre, not toward the Yusef delegation, toward Elias specifically. And in the carrier wave, in the old language, it transmitted 3 pulses that Elias's receiver caught and that he translated quietly for the delegation without breaking contact with the Veth. He said, "It says we know you. You are the one who changed the interval." And Elias said, not for the delegation but directly to the Veth, in the carrier wave device clipped to his uniform, "Yes." And the Veth held still for a long time, and then did something that none of the xenolinguists or behavioral analysts had a category for. It oriented its sensory cluster not in the compound eye configuration of assessment or in the leading joint angle of uncertainty, but in a position that the behavioral analyst would later describe, after much argument, as inquiry. Not assessment, not pattern recognition, actual inquiry. And it said, how do you arrive at solutions you cannot derive? And Elias Dre, who had grown up in a repair shop, who had survived 11 days on a Veth vessel by fixing things out of boredom and instinct, and the stubbornness of a man who could not let a broken system be, who had built a carrier wave device from field medical kit component S and the shape of a question in a language he had never been taught, turned the thumb and index finger rotation and thought for a moment, and said, the same way you arrive at questions you didn't know you had. You try things, you fail, you notice what failure teaches you, you try again, you build a feel for it. Eventually the feel is faster than the thinking. The Veth was quiet for a long time. Then it said, that is not derivable from first principles. And Elias said, no. And the Veth said, we have been attempting to derive it for 8 years. And Elias said, I know. That's why I built you a question instead of an answer. The negotiations lasted 4 years. Mara was present for most of them, in her capacity first as Elias's operational liaison, and then as the diplomatic structure formalized as the deputy to the Yusef lead negotiator. She watched the process from both sides of the room, or rather, from the Yusuf side of a room that was very slowly being reconfigured from the geometry of two separate sides into something that had more interesting angles. It was not a story of universal peace and understanding. The Veth had interests that conflicted with human interests in ways that were real and significant, and not resolvable by communication alone, and the process of negotiating those interests produced, on 17 separate occasions, moments that felt to Mara indistinguishable from the brink of war. The Veth had been in the business of organizing space for longer than humanity had been in the business of using it, and their sense of what constituted their territory was not always compatible with human settlement patterns or human expansion trajectories. There were concessions on both sides that felt, in the moment of their agreement, like defeat, and in the longer arc looked like something else. What sustained the process, Mara thought, was not the formal diplomatic machinery, though the machinery was necessary. What sustained it was something harder to categorize. The Veth were genuinely curious about humans in a way they had not been prepared for. Their model for organizable things did not include things that could not be organized, and humanity had demonstrated, over 4 years of negotiation and 8 years of contact, that it could not be organized. Not because it was chaotic, the Veth had seen chaos and had specific, well-developed systems for dealing with it, but because it was specifically, persistently, infuriatingly generative. It made things that didn't derive from first principles. It guessed. It failed and tried again, and arrived at solutions by feel. It modified systems it didn't fully understand, and somehow incomprehensibly improved them. This was, to the Veth, a form of knowledge they did not possess and could not derive, and this was the part that Mara thought was most important, could not dismiss. They had tried. They had spent 8 years attempting to formally account for human technological development, and the formal account kept coming out wrong. The math didn't fit. The derivations produced trajectories that should have been impossible, and humans had walked the trajectories anyway, stumbling and guessing and stubbornly, obnoxiously surviving. You could not organize something like that. You could only eventually acknowledge it. There was a specific session in the second year of formal negotiations that Mara would return to, in her memory, more often than any other. It was a technical exchange. The Yusef engineering team and a Veth analytical delegation working through the specific mechanisms of the Caspian. Modification, dissecting their massive timing interval in the kind of microscopic detail that was only interesting to engineers and linguists, and the kind of diplomats who understood that the technical exchanges were where the real negotiation happened, because they were the place where both sides were looking at the same object from different directions. The lead Veth analytical delegate had asked, through Priya's translation, about the specific moment of insight that had produced the modification, not the process. They understood the process now, or they understood the demonstration Elias had built. The moment, the single cognitive event in which the approach had shifted from fixed interval to responsive interval. Elias had said, simply, I noticed the air tasted different, the recycling was off, and I thought, what if the interval adjusted to match what the space needed instead of running on a fixed schedule? And then I tried it. The Veth delegate had processed this for a long time. Then it had asked, what does the air tasting different have to do with the interval adjustment? Elias had said, nothing, technically, but it's what made me notice the problem. I was looking for one thing, and I noticed something else, and that something else opened into the solution. The Veth had processed this for even longer. Then it had said, you solved a problem you were not looking for, using information you encountered by chance, by applying an approach that had no formal relationship to the original problem. Elias had said yes. The Veth had said, that is not a cognitive process. That is a series of accidents that produced a result. Elias had thought about that. Then he'd said maybe, but we do it reliably enough that it functions like a process, even if we can't derive it. And the Veth had gone quiet for a long time, and Priya, watching the Carrier Waves signal, had said to Mara very quietly, Marker 7. It just put that in Marker 7. It had placed the entire statement, the observation that humans reliably produced results through processes that couldn't be formally derived, in the grammatical position reserved for genuine unknowns worth inquiring about. Mara had stood in that room and felt something shift that she didn't have a name for. Not victory, not triumph. Something quieter and more permanent. The feeling of having been looked at, really looked at, by something ancient and vast and profoundly different, and been found, not admirable, not powerful, not worthy in the formal sense, but interesting. Genuinely, irreducibly, categorically interesting, worth the inquiry. Elias was there for all of it, and also not there. in the specific way that people who are essential to a process are often not present in the official record of it. He was not a diplomat. He was not technically a negotiator. He held no formal rank in the USEF hierarchy above civilian specialist, which was itself a designation that the USEF had created specifically for him because there was no existing category that fit what he did. He sat to the side of the formal delegations, working on one device or another. Always devices. Always the translation matrix growing more precise and the carrier wave vocabulary expanding and the Veth communication systems yielding slowly to his specific patient form of listening. And when the formal negotiations stalled, which they did regularly, he would look up from whatever he was working on and say something that was technically a technical note about the communication protocol and was almost always the thing that needed to be said. The Veth had a word for him. They used it in their formal communications alongside his identifier, and it had taken the xenolinguists 6 months to develop a working translation. The closest English equivalent was, depending on which linguist you asked, either interval changer or one who modifies the timing of systems. But the most literal translation, the one that the most senior xenolinguist had produced after the longest argument with herself, was this, the one who made the pause. Mara thought that was right. She had thought about it many times in the years that followed, and it always came back to the same point. What Elias had done that day in the examination space on the Veth vessel, in the maintenance shaft on Caspian, in Engineering Bay 4 on the threshold, in the neutral zone of the first formal meeting. The thing he had done, over and over, the thing that was specifically and irreducibly his, was pause. He had paused the pattern, not with force or declaration or the kind of heroism that announced itself, but with the specifically human act of doing something unexpected in the middle of what was supposed to be inevitable. A machine, dismantling a station, arrives at a sealed maintenance shaft. The human inside says, "Give me a minute," and it pauses. And everything that followed from that pause, the 14 months of carrier wave work, the 4 years of negotiation, the imperfect and grinding and often maddening progress towards something that was not peace exactly, but was its own kind of structure, responsive to the environment, adjusting its timing interval based on what the space actually needed. All of it lived inside that pause. Mara was 47 when the threshold framework was ratified, which was what they were calling the agreement, because the formal title was 17 words long in both English and Veth carrier wave protocol, and nobody was using it. She was standing on the observation platform, the same viewport, Platform 7, and the sky outside was different from the sky she had watched 8 years before. The Armada was gone. 3 Veth vessels remained in the outer systems as what the framework called mutual observation delegates, which was a diplomatic circumlocution for I'm watching you and you're watching me, and we've agreed that this is acceptable. Their pulse pattern was different, not the slow countdown rhythm of that first terrible holding position, but something more irregular, more conversational. The bimodal signal with the carrier wave active and the old language cycling in its underneath. Still here. She heard the half-step behind her and didn't need to look. "You should be at the ceremony," she said. "There's a ceremony?" "There's always a ceremony." He came to stand at the viewport. He had aged in the way of people who spend their time close to problems, not tired, exactly, but worn to a specific efficient shape, the unnecessary parts of expression stripped away until what remained was entirely itself. The thumb and index finger rotation, the half step, the precise patient focus. "I've been thinking about the counter-derivation," he said. "The Veth's counter-derivation of human problem-solving methodology? Yes. They've been working on it for 6 years. They think they have it now." He looked at the tablet. "They think the reason human intuition produces valid solutions is not because intuition is itself reliable, but because of the volume of failure that precedes each intuitive success. The pattern underlying guessing is the pattern of everything that didn't work, compressed and absorbed until it behaves like instinct. Is that accurate? More or less." He turned the rotation. "The interesting part is what they're going to do with it." "What are they going to do with it?" He looked at her. There was the brief, slight smile, the expression of a man who has arrived at an answer he isn't entirely sure is an answer. "They're going to fail at things," he said. "Deliberately. Experimentally. They've designed a series of what they're calling open interval exploration protocols, which is their phrase for trying things without knowing the derivation, guessing." He looked back at the viewport. "A species that's been deriving solutions from first principles for 100,000 years is going to learn to make mistakes." Mara looked at the 3 remaining Veth vessels pulsing slow and conversational in the dark. "How long do you think it will take?" she asked. I have no idea, he said. That's the point. She thought about the Veth using the word for him, the one who made the pause. She thought about a man in a maintenance shaft, scared and bored and stubborn, holding a timing mechanism he didn't fully understand and modifying it anyway. She thought about the moment he'd described in his first debrief session, 11 days aboard an alien vessel, the specific look of the Veth unit when it had stopped in the doorway of the examination space, the quality of its stillness. A double take, the most human thing. She thought about the fangs of fear. That was what the early reports had called the Fang-class vessels when they'd first appeared above New Helsinki because of the crescent shape, the way they looked from below like something opening its mouth. The Fangs of Fear. For 8 years, that name had lived in the public imagination as shorthand for extinction, for the specific terror of something ancient and organized and certain arriving to tidy up. For the clock running down. But the Fangs of Fear had a carrier wave underneath their primary pulse. They had an old language, something biological, something that had evolved before the formal derivation framework, before the systematic organization, something that was capable of Marker 7, of genuine inquiry toward genuine unknowns. They had been afraid too, in their way. Not the bell in the sternum kind, not the kind that made you reach for a timing mechanism in the dark, but the vast, ancient kind, the fear that you had arrived at the edges of your model and found something beyond it that your model could not account for, and that you did not have a process for what came next. Humanity had scared them, not with weapons, not with numbers, with incomprehensibility, with the specific madness of failing upward. And Elias Dre had looked at that incomprehensibility and said, I can explain this. Give me a minute. And they had given him a minute. And everything that had followed from that minute was still unfolding, still incomplete, still full of the productive wrong turns and stubborn reattempts and accidental side door solutions that were, apparently, humanity's most significant export to the universe. The methodology, the feel for it, the instinct born from failure. The Veth were learning to make mistakes now. With the deliberate rigor of a species that had never made one on purpose before. They would be terrible at it at first. They would fail at failing, which would produce its own interesting data. And then slowly, they would learn what failure taught, the way everything that had ever learned anything from failure had learned it. One wrong answer at a time, accumulating until the wrong answers formed a shape, and the shape pointed somewhere new. They built a memorial on the threshold before the ship was decommissioned. Not for the war, because there hadn't quite been a war, or for the victory, because that wasn't quite what it had been. They built it for the conversation. The plaque at the base of the memorial on Observation Platform 7 had 2 lines on it. The first was the date of the Callisto dismantlement, the beginning. The second was not a date, but 3 words, in both English and Veth carrier wave encoding, cast in the specific frequency band metal that the Veth had provided as their contribution to the memorial's construction. Give me a minute. Priya had argued for a longer inscription. Something that captured the complexity of it, the 14 months of carrier wave work, the 4 years of formal negotiation, the specific grammatical structure of Marker 7, and what it meant that a species of 100,000-year-old pattern matchers had placed humanity in it. She had argued well, she usually did. Elias had listened to her argument and then said, quietly, 3 words is enough. Mara had agreed. 3 words. The pause in the pattern, the interval that listened. Everything else was what grew inside it. Priya wrote the formal history of the contact period, all 14 volumes of it, over the decade following the threshold framework ratification. Mara read all 14. Elias read the technical chapters and the xenolinguistic analysis and skimmed the diplomatic narrative and read, very carefully, the final chapter, which Priya had titled The Question in Marker 7, and which was, by the judgment of every reviewer who assessed it, the most important section of the 14 volumes. Its central argument was simple, which was why it was important. The Veth had not come to destroy humanity. They had come to organize it. Those were not the same thing, but they were close enough that the distinction had very nearly been lost. What had preserved the distinction was not diplomacy or weapons or the cold calculation of military deterrence. What had preserved it was the demonstration that humanity was not organizable, that it contained something the Veth framework could not account for, and therefore could not dismiss, and therefore had to inquire about. The demonstration had been made by one person with a toolkit in a maintenance shaft. Priya's argument was that this was not coincidental, that the demonstration could only have been made by one person, in that place, in that specific moment of apparent defeat, not because the individual was exceptional, though he was, but because the quality he demonstrated was the quality of the many compressed into the actions of the one. Every wrong turn in human history, every failed experiment, every botched solution, every time someone had tried something that didn't work and tried again differently, and eventually, stubbornly, arrived at something that did. All of it had compressed into the specific instinct that reached for a timing mechanism in the dark and modified it based on a guess. He was not a hero. He was a sample, a very particular, irreducibly human sample of what the species had accumulated over centuries of failing forward. The Veth had studied the sample and found in it a question they couldn't derive in the grammatical position reserved for things worth knowing. The fear bell had a sound. But what Mara had learned in 8 years and 14 months and 4 years and all the time before and after was that the fear bell was not the signal to stop. It was the signal that something real was happening. The bell rang when the pattern broke, when the model required revision, when things were not going to proceed in the way that everything before them had made seem inevitable. The bell rang, and you took note of it and moved on. You picked up the broken thing in front of you, and you turned it over in your hands, and you listened to the way it hesitated, and you guessed at what it needed, based on everything you'd learned from every other broken thing, based on instinct and stababs, and the compulsion that was not heroism exactly, but was something upstream of it, the simple refusal to let something broken remain broken when you had hands and time and a sufficient supply of bloody-minded attention. You tried something. You failed. You noticed what failure taught you. You tried again. That was the thing the Veth could not derive. That was the thing that had taken 8 years for them to encounter and 4 more to articulate, and that they were now, with a deliberation and experimental rigor that was entirely their own, attempting to learn. Humanity's greatest contribution to galactic knowledge, the precise, accumulated, inefficient, irreplaceable knowledge of how to fail toward the right answer. You had to think that was worth something. You had to think the universe was a little more interesting for it. Outside the viewport, the 3 Veth vessels pulsed their carrier wave in the old language, responsive and patient, and still, after all this time, asking their question and receiving their answer. Still here. Still here. The fear bell was quiet, and the stars were where they'd always been, and somewhere in Engineering Bay, 4 the half step was already moving, and a new device was already growing on a workbench, listening to what the space actually needed, adjusting its intervals for a universe that had, against considerable expectation, decided to keep going. Give me a minute. And everything that could follow that would. There was a period, roughly the 3rd year of formal negotiations, the worst year by most measures, when Mara genuinely believed it would all collapse. It had started with the Meridian Compact, which was what human media was calling the territorial agreement that covered the outer belt. The Veth wanted exclusive operational control of 17 extraction points that had been mapped for human mining development. The mining consortium that held the development licenses represented 800,000 jobs and the economic backbone of 3 separate orbital habitats. The concession was, by any rational calculation, impossible, but the alternative to the concession was a return to the holding pattern, and Mara had learned enough by then to know that the holding pattern was not neutral. Every month in stasis was a month in which the Veth's patience arithmetic ticked forward, and the human political will to maintain the negotiation frayed a little more. There were voices on Earth, loud voices, organized voices, voices with significant media reach and parliamentary representation that were arguing for a military solution, not because the military solution was achievable. The honest assessment of every USEF tactical officer who had run the simulations was that humanity would lose a direct confrontation with the Armada catastrophically and quickly, but because the negotiation was slow and difficult and required giving things up. And there is always a constituency for the fast, hard thing over the slow, difficult thing, even when the fast, hard thing ends in ruin. Elias had spent the Meridian Compact crisis in Engineering Bay 4, which was where he spent most crises. Mara had found him there at hour 40 of the stalemate, sitting on the floor with his back against the secondary workbench, a cup of cold coffee at his elbow, the thumb and index finger rotation running. They won't move on the extraction points, she said. I know. And we can't give up 17 sites. The political math doesn't work. The political math on our side. What about theirs? She stopped. What do you mean? I mean, the Veth have internal dynamics, too. We assume they're monolithic because they communicate in a unified protocol, but the carrier wave exchanges in the last 6 weeks have had a harmonic variance I haven't seen before. Multiple distinct signal sources contributing to what presents as a single transmission. He turned the rotation. I think there's more than one voice in there. She sat down on a parts crate. You think they're not unified on the extraction points either. I think there's something in the old language, in the carrier wave, that hasn't been part of the formal negotiations. I think some of them want the extraction points for reasons the formal delegation isn't stating. What reasons? He was quiet for a moment. I think they want to study what we do with them. Not the minerals. We've established that the Veth have access to mineral resources that make our belt mining economically marginal by comparison. They don't want the sites for the resources. He looked at the cold coffee. I think they want to watch us work, the way you watch something you don't understand when you're trying to understand it. Mara sat with that. They want observation rights, without calling them that. Because calling them that would require explaining why, and explaining why would require acknowledging that they're still in active inquiry mode about human problem-solving methodology, and I think that acknowledgement is contentious on their side. Why would it be contentious? Because it means the formal derivation framework hasn't resolved us. It means after 8 years and 4 years of formal negotiation, they still can't account for us. And I think there's a faction in there, he gestured at the carrier wave data on the nearest tablet, that finds that unacceptable. She looked at the tablet, at the harmonic variance he'd been tracking. You've been watching their internal politics. I've been watching their carrier wave anomalies. The interpretation is mine, possibly wrong. It's not wrong, she said, because she had learned to trust his possibly wrong interpretations the way she trusted her own fear bell. Not because they were always accurate, but because they were always pointing at something real. What do we do with it? He picked up the cold coffee, looked at it, put it down. We offer them something they don't know they want, not the sites, the methodology. We offer to run joint extraction operations. Veth observation delegates embedded in human mining teams. He looked at her, not as oversight, as participants in an open interval exploration protocol. She stared at him. We invite them to watch us fail and fix it, he said, officially, with full documentation. We make the methodology the deliverable instead of the territory. She thought about the USEF mining consortium, the 800,000 jobs, the parliamentary voices with their hard and fast solutions. She thought about trying to explain to a committee that the extraction points were being offered as classrooms for alien observers to watch humans make mistakes. That's going to be a very difficult sell, she said. Is it harder to sell than a catastrophic military loss? She didn't answer that. He turned the rotation. I can write the technical framework. I can structure it in Marker 7. I can make sure the offer looks, in their carrier wave grammar, like what it is. An invitation to ask the question from inside rather than outside. He looked at her. You can sell the human side. You have tremendous confidence in me. You kept the channel open for 4 years, he said. So you've sold harder things. The Meridian Accord, the modification of the compact that included the Joint Operations Framework, was ratified 3 months later. The parliamentary voices were not silenced, but they were outnumbered, because Mara had made the argument, patiently and at length in 14 separate briefings across 6 committees, that the Joint Operations Framework was not a concession, but a demonstration. We are opening our working methodology to Veth observation, because our working methodology is the thing they cannot organize, and the thing they cannot organize is the thing that has kept us at this table for 4 years. We are inviting them to watch us be human. That argument had landed differently with different audiences. The economists had liked the access reciprocity clauses. The military had liked the intelligence value of having Veth delegates physically embedded in human operations. The scientists had been purely excited, which had helped. The politicians had needed the most work, and the work had been of the specific kind that required sitting with someone for a long time and letting them say the things they were afraid of until the fear had been fully articulated and could be addressed. She had done a lot of that sitting over those 3 months. It was not engineering. It was not translation. It was the kind of work that didn't have a name in the formal skill sets, and that was, in Mara's experience, at least as essential to survival as either. On the night the accord was ratified, she had found Elias on Observation Platform 7, which was where she usually found him when something significant had happened, and they had stood at the viewport and looked at the 3 Veth observer vessels pulsing their slow conversational rhythm in the dark, and he had said nothing for a long time, and she had said nothing, and eventually he had said, "The first joint operation is in 6 weeks. I know. Titan extraction, Site 4. I know. I approve the site selection." He turned the rotation. The Veth delegate assigned to the operation is from the command vessel. She looked at him. The one that ran the Caspian dismantlement. The one that found the maintenance shaft. She let that settle. The one that opened it. Yes. She looked back at the viewport. That's not a coincidence. No. He picked up a tablet, always a tablet, and looked at it without really seeing it. I think they sent someone who was there, who was part of the original pattern break, who was present when the question first became a question. He set the tablet down. I think they want to close the loop. Mara thought about a Veth unit moving through a station it was dismantling with systematic certainty, arriving at a sealed maintenance shaft, preparing to catalog and extract its contents, and then stopping, holding still in the doorway of the examination space while something inside it, scared and bored and infuriatingly alive, looked up from a timing mechanism it was modifying and said, "Give me a minute." 11 years later, that Veth unit was going to watch Elias Dre run a mining operation in person. She thought about what it had been like for the Veth, not the strategic implications, she'd spent years on those, but the experience. To arrive at the edges of your framework, to find something your derivation systems couldn't account for. To spend 8 years attempting the formal derivation and watching it fail, watching the model produce trajectories that shouldn't be possible. Watching the thing you couldn't derive keep making things you couldn't derive. To finally ask the question in the grammatical position of genuine inquiry and receive an answer you still couldn't fully process. She thought, they've been afraid too. Not of us exactly, of what we represent to their framework, of the genuine unknown. That was the thing the Fangs of Fear had feared, not humanity's weapons, not humanity's numbers. The specific, implacable terror of encountering something your framework cannot formally account for, and that refuses, stubbornly and cheerfully, to be organized. The one who made the pause, the one who changed the interval, the one who arrived in a maintenance shaft, in the middle of his own dismantlement, and said, I'm going to modify this. Give me a minute. I think I know something your framework doesn't. He hadn't known that was what he was saying. He'd just been cold and scared and bored. He'd just been fixing the only thing available to fix. He'd just been doing what Haverford's note in his certification file had said he always did, reaching for the broken system with no intention of leaving it broken, with no formal derivation and no guaranteed outcome, with nothing but the accumulated feel of having fixed 1,000 other broken things and the specific stubborn human conviction that this one could be fixed too. That was the answer to the Veth's question. Not the technical explanation of responsive timing intervals, not the formal description of intuitive problem-solving methodology, not the 14 volumes of contact history, just that. The feel for it. The refusal to leave the broken thing broken. The Titan joint operation produced, in its first week, 11 equipment failures, 3 procedure disputes between the human and Veth technical teams, 1 near incident with a pressure seal, and what Elias described in his operation log as the most interesting 6 hours he'd spent since Caspian. The Veth delegate from the command vessel, Priya, had assigned it the working name Interval because of the carrier wave transmissions in which it appeared most frequently, had observed all 11 equipment failures with the compound eye, orientation of genuine attention, not assessment, not the pattern recognition mode. The inquiry mode, marker 7 present in every carrier wave transmission it sent back to the fleet. On day 4, Interval had done something that stopped the entire operation cold. It had picked up a broken piece of extraction equipment that the human team had, set aside for repair, and it had examined it, and then it had, very carefully, very slowly, with the jointed precision of a species that had been building things in space for 100,000 years, attempted to fix it, not based on a formal derivation. The human team lead had later said that what Interval had done was clearly an attempt at something outside the standard Veth engineering protocol. It had tried an approach that had no formal justification. It had, in the specific sense that Elias had demonstrated to them, guessed. It had been wrong. The equipment had not been fixed. The guess had failed, and Interval had oriented its sensory cluster toward Elias with the specific angle of the inquiry mode, and the carrier wave transmission it sent had contained marker 7, and a structure that Priya, watching the feed from the threshold, had translated as, I attempted the process. The process failed. What did failure teach? Elias had looked at the broken equipment, at the specific way Interval had tried to fix it, and failed. At the 12 members of the human technical team watching with various expressions that ranged from professionally neutral to openly delighted. He had crouched down beside the equipment and looked at what Interval had done. Then he had said, in the carrier wave device, you move the connector housing. That's a reasonable approach. It addresses the visible damage. But the underlying failure is in the timing circuit, which isn't visible from the outside. The way you know the visible damage isn't the cause, is the smell. Interval had been still for a long time. Then it had said, the smell, yes. Burnt insulation has a specific smell. you learn to notice it. And Interval had said, you diagnose the system through olfactory information that was not formally connected to the relevant failure mode. Yes, it's faster than running the full diagnostic. And Interval had said, that is an example of the methodology. Yes. And then, for the first time in any recorded interaction with any human in any contact event, over 12 years of the Veth's presence in the solar system, Interval did something that had no category in any of the behavioral analyses or xenolinguistic frameworks. It laughed, or the Veth equivalent, or whatever it was, a rapid pulse sequence in the carrier wave that didn't match any communicative structure in the database. That was clearly not a status query, or a formal statement, or a Marker 7 inquiry that appeared in Priya's translation as something between surprise and the specific delight of arriving somewhere unexpected. Elias, crouching beside the broken equipment with a diagnostic tool in his hand, had looked at Interval for a long moment, and then he had laughed too. That was the story Mara told when she was asked to speak at the framework's anniversary commemorations, which she was asked to do for 30 years running until she politely declined the 31st. Not the formal history, not the 14 volumes, not the diplomatic framework or the territorial accords or the military de-escalation architecture. The story she told was about a Veth unit crouching beside a broken piece of mining equipment on Titan's surface, attempting to fix it based on a guess, failing, and finding something in the failure that was worth the specific rapid pulse sequence that had no category in any behavioral database, finding in the failure the beginning of the feel for it. She told that story because it was the true one. The true story was not a story of strength or strategy or the hard calculus of survival. It was a story of two different kinds of intelligence encountering a broken thing and approaching it differently and learning, slowly and imperfectly, and with considerable mutual bafflement, what the other's approach had to teach. The Veth had come to the solar system with the architecture of certainty, 100,000 years of derivation from first principles, a knowledge base so complete that it had ceased to produce surprises, a methodology so correct that failure had become a theoretical concept rather than an experience. They had arrived at the edges of known space and found, in the asteroid belt, something that their framework classified as organizable and their derivation systems classified as a low-complexity technological civilization and their pattern recognition matrices classified as quantifiable. And the thing they had classified as quantifiable had, in a maintenance shaft on a station it was dismantling, asked them to wait, just for a minute, while it finished doing something that had no formal justification and arrived at a solution that shouldn't have been possible. And they had waited, and the wait had changed the interval. And the changed interval had over 12 years of contact and 4 years of formal negotiation, and one very important afternoon on Titan's surface become the gap in which two different kinds of knowledge about the universe had begun, very slowly, very imperfectly, with many failures and considerable mutual bafflement, to ask each other questions, not in the mode of assessment, not in the mode of pattern recognition, in the grammatical position of genuine inquiry toward genuine unknowns, in the mode that said, I don't know what you are, you don't fit my model. You are, categorically, a genuine unknown. Tell me more. Mara was 61 when she retired from Yusef's service, and 63 when she published her own account of the contact period, which she had titled, with the specific bluntness that had characterized her professional life, What Failure Teaches. It was not a diplomatic history or a technical analysis. It was the account of a person who had stood at Observation Platform 7 on the Yusef, carrier threshold, and heard the fear bell ring, and had carried that bell with her for 20 years, and had learned, in the company of a man who turned timing mechanisms over in his hands and modified them based on feel, what the bell actually meant. It meant something real is happening. It meant the pattern is breaking. It meant whatever comes next cannot be derived from everything that came before. It meant you are at the edge of your model, and the edge of your model is not the end of everything. It is the beginning of the only thing worth knowing, what comes after the edge. She dedicated the book to Haverford, the chief engineer at Bering Transit Station, who had written in a certification file 30 years earlier that if you gave Elias Dre access to a broken system in sufficient time, he would either repair it or die trying, and that if he died trying, he would leave very good notes about what he found. He had not died trying. He had left very good notes. The universe, in its particular unhurried way, was still reading them. Outside Observation Platform 7, 3 Veth vessels pulsed their carrier wave in the old language. Still here after all this time, still asking their question and receiving their answer, still patient with the slow, imperfect, stubbornly generative process of two kinds of knowledge, learning to fail productively in each other's direction. The fear bell was quiet. The stars held. And somewhere in the belt, at Site 4 on Titan, a Veth delegate crouched beside a piece of equipment that wasn't working and tried. Something without a formal derivation, based on a feel it was still developing, and failed, and noticed what the failure taught, and tried again, learning one wrong answer at a time. The specific human art of failing toward the right one. Give me a minute. The pause that changed the interval that listened. Everything else was what grew inside it, and it grew and grew and grew, the way things do, when they've found the right conditions, when the timing is responsive to the environment, when the system finally listens to what the space actually needs, when something in the dark, ancient, and vast, and certain of its own completeness, finds a sealed maintenance shaft it wasn't expecting and opens it, and the thing inside looks up and says, "I'm not done yet." Not a weapon, not a declaration, just a man and a broken thing, and the accumulated feel of 1,000 other broken things, and the specific, irreducible, underivable, unkillable human insistence that whatever was broken could be fixed if you just gave it enough time and enough wrong answers and the right kind of attention. Give me a minute. And the universe, for once, did.